England was never kind to women who carried secrets. Yet Catherine Carey was born carrying one so dangerous that it followed her from cradle to grave, a whisper that she was not her father's child. But her kings. The year was 1524, and the court of Henry VIII was already a cauldron of lust, betrayal, and ambition. Her mother, Mary Boleyn, had once been the king's mistress, her beauty fading into rumour, her honour traded for royal favour. When Mary's husband, William Carey, claimed the infant as his own, few believed it. Even fewer dared to say aloud what they all suspected, that the tiny girl with the king's bright eyes carried Tudor blood. From the start, Catherine's life read like a ghost story written inside the royal nursery. She grew up in a world where one wrong glance could destroy a family, where love was currency and loyalty was poison. Her aunt, Boleyn, would rise to become Queen of England, only to lose her head on the scaffold of the Tower. Her uncle, George, would fall beside her. Catherine, still a child, watched the glittering promise of her family turn into a nightmare. She saw her surname become a death sentence. In those dark days, she learned what all Tudor women eventually learned. Survival was an art painted in silence. But silence did not mean insignificance. Catherine was clever, patient, and graceful. Everything a court could desire in a woman who knew when to speak and when to bow. When she was married in 1540 to Francis Knollys, a loyal Protestant courtier, it seemed a peaceful match. Yet beneath that surface calm lay the same pulse of ambition that had driven her mother and her aunt before her. The union bound the disgraced Boleyn bloodline to a rising political family, a second chance at survival, perhaps even redemption. And then came the children. 16 times, Catherine's body carried life. 16 times she faced the edge of death, praying through each fever and each long night while midwives whispered and candles guttered low. In an age where childbirth could kill a queen as easily as a peasant, surviving once was luck. Surviving 16 times was a miracle. Her womb became her kingdom, her weapon, and her cage. Every son and daughter was another alliance, another lifeline for a family that had once stood beside the throne and fallen beneath the axe. Her eldest, Henry Knollys, became a statesman. William rose to be the Earl of Banbury. Francis thundered in Parliament, and Lettice Knollys was the spark that reignited royal fury. For when that beautiful, fiery daughter dared to marry Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, the one man Queen Elizabeth truly loved, the court exploded with scandal. The Virgin Queen could forgive treason more easily than she could forgive love. Lettice was banished. Her name, a wound that would never heal. And in that wound lay the echo of Catherine's own life, a woman bound by loyalty to a queen who might also have been her sister. For Catherine Carey was no mere lady-in-waiting. She became Chief Lady of the Bedchamber to Elizabeth I, a role of intimate power, tending to the Queen's every ritual, her every secret. The two women shared blood, or something close to it. If the whispers were true, if Catherine was indeed Henry VIII's daughter, then she and Elizabeth shared more than kinship. They shared the same father, the same crown in their veins, the same haunted understanding that their lives were both gifts and curses from a man whose love destroyed as much as it created. Through the long years of Elizabeth's reign, Catherine stood beside her cousin, or half-sister, as a steady flame in the Queen's shadow. When rebellions rose, when suitors schemed, when the Spanish threat gathered like thunder over the seas, Catherine was there. Her children filled the court, her sons serving the crown, her daughters weaving through noble houses like silk threads binding the fragile fabric of England together. And though the Queen ruled alone, she was never truly without family. Catherine's brood became the living heart of Elizabethan power, the hidden Tudor bloodline. Invisible but vital, breathing through Parliament and palace alike. By the time Catherine died in 1569, her body worn to the bone by years of duty and childbirth, even the Queen wept. Elizabeth ordered her cousin buried in Westminster Abbey, a place reserved for royalty and saints, and walked behind the coffin herself. Some said it was grief for a loyal servant. Others whispered that the Queen was burying her only sister. Whatever the truth, the Abbey bells tolled not only for a woman, but for an entire generation of Tudor women who had endured in silence while kings raged and crowns changed hands. Catherine Carey, the mother of 16, the possible daughter of Henry VIII, lived and died in a world that measured a woman's worth in heirs and obedience. Yet her legacy outlived those who crowned and killed. Her blood flowed through courtiers, nobles, and statesmen, and through her daughter Lettice. That blood nearly toppled a queen. The Virgin Queen and the mother of 16, two halves of the same story, one barren by choice, the other broken by childbirth, their fates forever entwined, their rivalry eternal. And that is the secret the Abbey keeps. Beneath its stone floors lies the woman who may have been England's hidden princess, whose children carried royal blood into every chamber of power, and whose shadow followed Elizabeth until the Queen's final breath. Catherine Carey was never crowned, yet she changed the destiny of a kingdom not with a sword, but with 16 cries of newborn life that echoed longer than any trumpet of war. Catherine Carey's childhood was born from rumour, raised on caution, and bathed in the uncertain glow of borrowed power. Before she could even speak, her name carried both privilege and peril, because in Tudor England, blood was everything, and hers was whispered to be half royal. Her mother, Mary Boleyn, had once been the brightest ornament of Henry VIII's court, her laughter ringing through feasts, her hair like sunlight against tapestries of gold. But the court's adoration was fickle, and Mary soon learned how quickly beauty curdled into danger when it drew the king's gaze too long. By the time Catherine was old enough to remember faces, her mother was no longer the celebrated mistress of a monarch, but a woman quietly tolerated, her family's fortunes sinking, while another Boleyn rose higher and higher toward the crown. Catherine's earliest memories must have shimmered with confusion, the hum of court gossip, the cold glances from servants who bowed, yet whispered as soon as they turned away, the strange reverence people showed when her small hand was lifted, or when they looked into her eyes and thought they saw the reflection of a king. Childhood in such a world was not an innocence, but an apprenticeship in fear. She learned to smile when she wanted to shrink away, to bow when her name was spoken in dangerous tones, and to carry silence as both shield and weapon. The Boleyn family, for all their brilliance, was a house built on shifting sand. When Anne Boleyn captured the king's heart, the entire clan soared on the gust of royal favour. They dressed in silks, spoke with confidence, and strutted through palaces that only years before had seemed unreachable. And in those glittering halls, the little girl, Catherine, was both treasure and threat, a living reminder of Mary's affair with the same man now bound to marry her aunt. It is easy to imagine how she watched Anne sharp, radiant, untouchable, and wondered if this new queen looked at her with pride or with pity. Did Anne ever study the child's face and see in it the trace of their shared secret? Did she sense the danger that would come of too much resemblance, too much ambition, too much memory of the past? When the storm broke, it broke without mercy. Catherine, still barely a girl, was old enough to understand terror when it filled the household. Anne's laughter was replaced by whispers of arrest, then the gallop of horses in the night, then the awful stillness that came before the axe fell at the tower. George Boleyn's name vanished from every mouth, his body erased from the world, but not from the nightmares of those who had loved him. The family's glory turned to ashes in a single season. And in that silence, Catherine learned what her mother already knew in England. A woman's closeness to power was measured by how quickly she could be destroyed by it. Perhaps that was when she began to harden, not into bitterness, but into endurance. She would never speak the words that ruined her aunt. She would never let passion or pride make her reckless. If she carried the blood of Henry VIII, she would carry it quietly. The rumour of royal blood was both a crown and a curse. It opened doors that others could not pass through. But every open door also framed a target. The years that followed were a long education in survival. The Boleyn name, once a melody, became a whisper, spoken only behind closed doors. Mary, ever pragmatic, sought peace away from court. Her days now filled with the ordinary rhythm of family life. And Catherine, growing from child to young woman, became the keeper of her mother's unspoken memories, the proof that love and ruin often walked hand in hand. In quiet rooms, she must have heard the story retold in half sentences of her mother's time with the king, of Anne's downfall, of the way beauty and wit could build a throne and then lose it before morning. These were not fairy tales, they were warnings. When Catherine first returned to court, the world had changed. Henry had buried more than one wife and broken more than one promise. England itself was restless, trembling between old faith and new, between papal loyalty and Protestant rebellion. The girl who arrived at court carried herself with the calm of someone who knew how quickly fortune turned. Her beauty was not as dazzling as her aunt's had been, but there was something in her eyes, quiet intelligence, careful watchfulness that drew the notice of those who understood the art of survival. She became, in a sense, that her family's redemption polite where others had been proud, measured where others had been reckless. It was in those years that she caught the attention of Francis Knollys, a man steady in character and secure in conscience. The kind of husband who valued faith and loyalty more than fortune. Their marriage in the year 1540 was not a love story in the romantic sense. But in Tudor, England love was rarely the foundation of anything lasting. It was a partnership of survival. He offered her safety and respect. She offered him the prestige of a name still glimmering with royal rumour. Together they became a bridge between disgrace and restoration. Marriage brought Catherine the illusion of peace. But even peace was demanding. The court never truly let her go. Her name, her connections, her blood all tied her to a world that would not stop watching. And soon, the rhythm of her life became the rhythm of childbirth. One child, then another, and another. Each birth, an agony that blurred the line between triumph and death. The midwives whispered prayers, the air thick with the scent of wax and sweat. The sound of her own breathing, echoing like waves against the walls. Sometimes, the cries of the newborn broke through like sunlight. Sometimes there was only silence. And yet she endured, because she had been raised to endure. Her body was the last battlefield of her family's ambition. And every child born was another victory snatched from oblivion. As her household grew, so did her understanding of power. The court was no longer merely a place of splendour. It was a living organism that fed on gossip and alliance. Catherine became its quiet strategist. She knew which child should be sent to serve in whose house, which friendship to encourage, which favour to decline. Her hands no longer held jewels or royal gifts. They held the threads of an invisible web stretching from her nursery to the Queen's chamber. In those years, she may have begun to realise that her greatest influence would never come from her own voice, but from the lives she shaped in silence. When Henry VIII died, and the crown passed to his frail son, Edward, the court shifted again. Restless as the tide, religion turned sharp. The favour became dangerous. and the air itself seemed filled with plots. Through it all, Catherine moved like a ghost of composure, cautious, faithful, untouchable. She had learned her lessons well. Her children would never know the ruin that had devoured her aunt. They would thrive, one way or another. And yet, beneath that steady calm, there must have been the quiet ache of memory. She had once seen a queen's head fall, seen her mother's tears. I felt the weight of whispers that said she herself might be the king's child. Every victory she gained came shadowed with the fear that it could be taken away. Every safe night was borrowed time. That fear, however, did not paralyze her. It became the rhythm of her endurance. As the years slipped by, Catherine Carey turned survival into an art so seamless that the world mistook it for grace. She learned that the most powerful women in England were not always those who wore crowns, but those who could move unseen, steadying the hands of those who ruled, carrying secrets that could unmake kingdoms. In time, her name would stand quietly beside a queen's. Her children would carry her legacy into every corner of the realm, and history would remember her as the woman who endured 16 labours and perhaps one impossible truth, that she was born of a king's sin and a mother's silence. And though the world would never know which father's blood truly ran in her veins, Catherine Carey had already learned the answer that mattered most in a kingdom built on betrayal. Survival was the truest form of nobility. Marriage to Francis Knollys was supposed to bring Catherine Carey peace. But peace in Tudor England was never gentle. It came wrapped in duty and expectation, a bargain between body and faith. Francis was steadfast and pious, a man of quiet convictions and Protestant devotion, and he loved order the way soldiers love their armour. Catherine, raised among shifting fortunes and whispered secrets, had long understood that obedience was a safer refuge than passion. Together, they formed a household of discipline and endurance, a home that would one day echo with the cries of 16 children and the relentless prayers of a mother who could never rest. Their marriage was a kind of alliance forged from survival, two souls balancing between the sins of the past and the hopes of a dynasty yet to come. The early years of their union must have felt like the calm before a storm that would never end. Catherine's first pregnancy came quickly, her youth still unspent, her spirit quietly trembling with the knowledge of what awaited her. Every Tudor woman knew the cost of childbirth, the blood, the fever, the silence that might follow. The church blessed the act. The husband expected it, but only women truly knew the terror of it. Catherine entered labour surrounded by midwives and prayers, the air thick with candle smoke, the walls close as though they, too, held their breath. When the first cry of her son Henry broke through the night, it was not only the birth of a child, but the beginning of her lifelong captivity to motherhood. She was 20 years old, and already her body belonged to history more than to herself. There was little time to recover, for the rhythm of her life became the rhythm of expectation. A woman who bore one child was blessed. A woman who bore many was sanctified, but to survive 16 labours was something beyond mortal. With every year, her strength was tested again. William came next, then Francis, and soon the nursery was a realm of tiny voices and restless nights. Francis Knollys built his reputation in Parliament and in the Queen's service, his career moving upward with measured certainty. But behind his success stood the endless endurance of his wife. Catherine ruled her household like a small kingdom, feeding, teaching, disciplining, loving, and mourning for in Tudor England. Even a healthy baby was a fragile miracle. The death of one was a wound that never healed. The survival of another, a fragile grace. In those years, Catherine's days were marked by repetition. The smell of linen boiled in water, the the sound of wet cloths wrung and folded, the rhythm of prayers whispered in the quiet hours between dusk and dawn. The world saw only her patience, her composure, her faith. But inside, she must have carried the weight of exhaustion like a stone in her chest. Her body bore the record of every birth, the scars, the weakness, the tremors of old fevers that never quite left. Yet she kept moving, because women like her were not allowed to stop. The court called her fertile. The church called her blessed. No one called her tired. It is tempting to imagine that among those 16 births, there were moments of quiet rebellion, a night when she sat by the fire and longed for the silence of a life without duty, a dawn when she held a newborn and whispered words of love that had nothing to do with politics or legacy. Perhaps she looked at her children and felt both pride and grief, knowing that each one was another thread, tying her to a destiny she could never escape. She was a mother, but she was also a vessel carrying not only the lives of her children, but the ambitions of every man around her. By the time her younger daughters were born, Catherine's name had become synonymous with endurance. The Knollys family prospered because of her womb, because of the alliances her children made, because of the favor she maintained in the silent corridors of power. And yet, amid all the noise of court and family, there was always that shadow, the whisper that she carried the king's blood. It followed her through every birth, every christening, every audience with the crown. Deed, Elizabeth. When she looked upon her cousin, I see in her face the same trace of their father's jaw, the same flicker of fire in their eyes. Did Catherine ever sense that the Queen's affection was not only loyalty, but recognition? These were questions neither woman dared to voice. For in Tudor England, truth was as dangerous as treason. When Queen Mary took the throne after the death of Edward, England turned once more to fire and fear. Francis and Catherine, devout Protestants, fled across the sea with their growing brood, seeking refuge in exile. It was a strange kind of safety the family huddled in foreign towns, living on faith and memory, while the homeland burned heretics in God's name. Catherine bore another child, even in exile, her body unbroken, her spirit somehow anchored to the rhythm of survival. It was in those bleak years that she must have realized how deep her endurance ran. The world had stripped her family of home, comfort, and certainty, but it could not strip her of the one thing she had always possessed: the quiet will to outlast everything. When the fires of Mary's reign dimmed and Elizabeth rose to the throne, Catherine returned home like a ghost, reclaiming its place among the living. England itself seemed reborn under the new Queen, golden, radiant, dangerous. And at the heart of that golden age, Catherine found her calling. Elizabeth trusted her more than any woman alive, naming her chief lady of the bedchamber, the keeper of the Queen's most private world. To hold such a position was no small thing. It meant tending to the Queen's gowns, her jewels, her letters, her silences. It meant sleeping in adjoining rooms, knowing the sound of the Queen's breathing, her weeping, her restless nights. It meant becoming, in every way, the other half of her solitude. In those candlelit chambers, perhaps the two women found an unspoken understanding. The Queen, who ruled through restraint, and the cousin who had endured through surrender, one barren by choice, the other hollowed by childbirth. Between them flowed a bond stronger than friendship, softer than politics. Catherine had carried 16 children, Elizabeth none, and yet both women had given their bodies to England in different ways. One to bear life, the other to deny it. One to populate the realm with loyal blood, the other to rule it alone. Together they formed the strange dual heartbeat of a dynasty that refused to die. As the years unfolded, Catherine watched her children rise like stars in the Queen's firmament. Her sons found seats in Parliament. Her daughters served at court. Her family name carried respect once more. But for all their successes, she never escaped the echo of loss. Not all her children survived. Not all her labours brought joy. Some graves remained unmarked. Some tears never dried. She buried her pain beneath prayer and duty, wearing serenity like armour. To the world she was a paragon of faith and service. But within her breast lay the quiet ache of a woman who had given too much. By the late years of the 1560s, Catherine's health began to falter. The strain of so many births, the years of exile, the endless service had taken their toll. Still, she rose each morning to tend to the Queen. Her movements slower, but her composure unchanged. Those who saw her at court described her as calm, dignified, almost ethereal, as though she lived half in this world and half in the next. Perhaps she already sensed that her time was drawing near. The Queen's affection for her deepened, though it was rarely spoken. Elizabeth, so wary of human closeness, trusted Catherine as she trusted no one else. When death finally came in the year 1569, it was gentle but unyielding. Catherine had given her strength to others for so long that there was little left for herself. The Queen's grief was said to be profound. She ordered that her cousin be buried in Westminster Abbey, a place of kings. It was a farewell worthy of the hidden daughter of Henry VIII, though no one dared say the words aloud. The Abbey bells tolled, and England mourned a woman who had lived in silence and shaped a kingdom through her endurance. Even in death, Catherine Carey was surrounded by whispers of loyalty, of mystery, of blood that might have been royal. Her 16 children stood as her true monuments, each one carrying her memory into the future. The world would remember Elizabeth as the Virgin Queen. But in truth, the pulse of Tudor blood continued through Catherine's line, through her daughter's laughter, her son's ambition, her family's unbroken resilience. She had been the quiet heart of the Tudor age, and long after her body was laid to rest beneath the Abbey stones, her story continued to breathe in every corner of England. When the Abbey bells fell silent, and Catherine Carey's body was lowered into the cold stone of Westminster, England seemed to hold its breath. The Queen herself had walked behind the coffin, her face pale, her eyes dry, the weight of state pressing down upon a grief she could not publicly name. The courtiers whispered that it was merely duty that Elizabeth honoured a faithful servant as she honoured the dead of noble birth. But those who stood close enough to see her trembling hands knew better. The Virgin Queen had lost the one woman who had understood her silences, the one companion who had lived her same secret pain, the one presence that had steadied her heart when the world turned cruel. And yet, even as the body of Catherine was sealed beneath marble, her story did not end. The echo of her name lived on through the 16 children who bore it, each one a fragment of her endurance, each one destined to carry her shadow into the tangled heart of the Elizabethan court. Among them all, it was Lettice Knollys who would carve her mother's name into history's memory, not through piety or obedience, but through defiance. She was Catherine's daughter in beauty and spirit, with the Boleyn fire burning behind her composed smile, her auburn hair catching the same light that once crowned Anne Boleyn before the fall. Lettice grew up in the palace corridors, her laughter floating through the same chambers where her mother had once served in quiet devotion. The Queen loved her at first, for she was family and youth and beauty, all woven into one bright creature. But beauty at the Tudor court was never harmless, and Elizabeth, who had built her power on the image of the untouchable Virgin, could not bear to see her own reflection outshone. Lettice was married young, as her mother had been, to Walter Devereux, the Earl of Essex, a man of ambition and cold demeanour, whose loyalties lay as much in battlefields as in marriage. Their union was a match of politics, not affection, and Lettice, restless by nature, lived within it like a bird behind glass. When Walter left for Ireland, seeking glory and royal favour, the court grew dangerous for those left behind. For in those golden years of Elizabeth's reign, one man held the Queen's heart captive, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. Handsome, charming, and unreachably close to power, he had known Elizabeth since childhood, had shared her imprisonment and her triumph, had stood beside her through war and rebellion. To the world, he was her favourite, perhaps a secret love. And yet it was Catherine's daughter, Lettice, who captured his passion in the shadows where no eyes could see. It was a love that began like fire caught in dry leaves, quick, reckless, and impossible to extinguish. The court murmured. The servants watched. The Queen pretended not to notice. But when Lettice's husband died, under suspicious circumstances in Ireland, tongues sharpened like knives. Within months, she and Dudley were married in secret, defying both etiquette and common sense. It was an act that sent tremors through the realm, for it was not merely scandal, it was a wound carved directly into the Queen's pride. The Virgin Queen could forgive treason. She could pardon rebellion, but she could not forgive a rival in love. The confrontation between Elizabeth and Lettice was the kind of moment that changes the air in a room. The Queen, furious, stood blazing in her jewelled gown, the embodiment of sovereign wrath. Lettice, younger and radiant, met her eyes without flinching. Words were exchanged that history will never record. But those who were near enough to hear said the silence afterward was more terrible than shouting. Elizabeth called her the she-wolf and banished her from court forever. In that single instant, the daughter of Catherine Carey became the woman the Queen could never bear to see again. Yet exile did not destroy Lettice. It only transformed her. She withdrew to her estates with Dudley, the man who had risked everything to love her. Together they built a life away from the Queen's gaze. A strange marriage of passion and politics. For Dudley remained a man of influence, forever walking the thin line between loyalty and ambition. When he rode to war against Spain, when he stood beside Elizabeth at the triumph of Tilbury, Lettice watched from afar, her pride mixed with bitterness. She had married for love, and love had made her invisible. Their son, Robert, known as the Noble Imp, was the living symbol of their forbidden union, the child who might one day carry the Dudley name beyond disgrace. The Queen tolerated his existence, but never his presence. When the boy died young, it was as though the last thread between Lettice and Elizabeth snapped forever. The Queen mourned him in silence, for even in her anger, she had loved the man who fathered him. But she did not reach out to the mother who wept alone. Lettice buried her son beneath a marble effigy. Her tears, the final inheritance of a life built on defiance. Meanwhile, the sons of Catherine Carey carried their mother's resilience into every corner of the kingdom. William Knollys, the steady and pragmatic one, rose to the title of Earl of Banbury, guiding the family through the dangerous tides of politics. Francis, sharp-tongued and unyielding, became a fiery voice in Parliament, his speeches echoing with the same moral conviction that had once defined his father. Henry, the eldest, served quietly and faithfully, his loyalty never questioned. They were men moulded by their mother's endurance, each one carrying within him the memory of her unspoken sacrifices at court. However, the Knollys' name was both honoured and haunted. To serve the Queen meant to live under her gaze, and the Queen never forgot betrayal. Lettice's exile tainted them all. Though Elizabeth could never bring herself to sever the family completely, they were, after all, her kin, her mirror of what she might have been if she had chosen marriage over majesty, love over loneliness. Perhaps, in her private chambers, Elizabeth sometimes thought of Catherine and of the quiet strength that had once steadied her, and wondered if she had driven away not just a cousin's daughter but a reflection of the sister she might have loved. As the years deepened, Lettice became a legend, whispered about in the candlelit corridors she no longer walked. Her beauty faded, but her pride remained unbroken. When Robert Dudley died in 1588, leaving her a widow once more, she stood at his funeral, cloaked in black velvet, her face veiled, but her posture regal. The courtiers watched from a distance, uncertain whether to pity or fear her. Elizabeth, though she ordered the ceremony, did not attend. The two women would never meet again, though their names would forever be intertwined like the twin halves of one destiny, the Virgin Queen who ruled England, and the woman who dared to love the man she could not. But the story of Catherine's children did not end in bitterness. Through their marriages and service, the Knollys line spread through England's nobility, binding their mother's blood into the very structure of the realm. Her daughters served in the Queen's household. Her sons held command in Parliament and in war. Her descendants would one day sit among the peers of the Stuart court. The rumour of royal blood never faded. It lingered, half acknowledged, half denied, a secret too potent to be forgotten. It became the quiet inheritance of every Knollys born thereafter, the whisper that they were not merely noble, but something greater, something that pulsed with the legacy of a king's sin and a woman's endurance. By the time Elizabeth's own life began to dim, the ghosts of the past crowded closer. The Queen, old and weary, surrounded by the children of those who had once served her, must have felt Catherine's presence still in the loyalty of her sons, in the defiance of her daughter, in the very air of the palace that had known them both. The Virgin Queen would die without heir, her bloodline ending with her, but the hidden Tudor line would live on through the womb she had buried with such honour years before. In that truth lies the strange poetry of Catherine Carey's legacy, that the woman who served silently, who lived within shadows, who died without fanfare, gave birth to a dynasty that outlived queens. Her daughter's rebellion and her son's faith were the twin echoes of her own divided soul, loyalty and defiance, endurance and fire. And though history would try to bury her beneath marble and rumour, the truth of her life still glimmers through the centuries, the story of the mother who gave England 16 lives, and through them, an immortal memory. As the long light of Elizabeth's reign deepened into gold, the sons of Catherine Carey moved like steady pillars beneath the crown she had once served. They carried her name, her patience, and the quiet courage that had sustained her through 16 births and a lifetime of silence. The court knew their faces well. William Knollys with his calm authority and measured gaze, Francis Knollys, the younger, with his fire and conviction, Henry, with his steadiness and sense of duty. They were men raised in the shadow of a woman who had taught them that loyalty was a form of survival, and that service to the Queen was not merely obligation, but inheritance. Each carried within him a spark of the mother buried in Westminster, a memory of her strength that shaped the way they lived and loved. William, the eldest to outlive his brothers, grew into a man the Queen could trust. His speech was slow, his temper rare, and his composure unshakable, even amid the chaos of Elizabeth's court, a place where ambition rotted faster than fruit in summer heat. While other nobles plotted and whispered, William remained the stillness at the edge of the storm. His reward was gradual, carved from years of patience and restraint. Titles came to him like slow dawns, first as a courtier, then as Viscount, and finally, the coveted title of Earl of Banbury. The Queen respected him not for brilliance, but for endurance, the same virtue his mother had mastered so perfectly. It was said that when Elizabeth spoke with him, she softened, for in his presence she felt the echo of Catherine's steadying hand, the calm voice that had once soothed her fears in sleepless nights. Francis Knollys, the younger, was made of sharper metal. The fire that Catherine had buried under silence burned bright within him, spilling into words that stirred Parliament and unsettled courtiers. He was devout, unbending, sometimes reckless. A man who believed that truth should never be sacrificed for comfort. His speeches were filled with the fierce Protestant conviction that had driven his father into exile during Queen Mary's reign. And each word he spoke carried the echo of that struggle. He argued for faith, for conscience, for the soul of England itself. Some called him too rigid. Others admired his courage, but none could ignore him. The Queen tolerated his boldness. Even when it pressed too close to her own authority, she saw in him something she could not name, perhaps the reflection of Catherine's will, or perhaps the conscience she herself no longer possessed. And then there was Henry, the eldest son, who never sought the spotlight, but held the family together with quiet devotion. His life was one of service, not glory. His loyalty unquestioned. His presence a steady comfort in a court that devoured peace. He had been his mother's firstborn, the one she had carried through her first storm of childbirth, the one whose cry had taught her that pain could coexist with triumph. It seemed almost poetic that his life should be the calmest among his siblings, a balance to their passions and ambitions. Henry's path was simple yet profound: to serve, to protect, to endure. Through him, the Knollys family preserved the grace of its matriarch, the patience that had once held an empire's breath. The years were turbulent. Across the sea, Spain gathered its might, building the great armada that would test the strength of Elizabeth's realm. In London, the air thickened with fear and faith alike. The Queen's Court became both a sanctuary and a hive of whispers, alliances shifting, loyalties tested, promises made in candlelight and broken by dawn. The Knollys' sons stood among those who prepared England for its greatest trial. Francis, with his fiery speeches, urged Parliament to defend the realm and the Protestant faith against the threat of invasion. William organised supplies, troops, and logistics with the patience of a man who knew that wars were won not only by valour, but by preparation. Even Henry, older now, lent his counsel to those who sought stability amid the rising storm. When Elizabeth rode to Tilbury in her silver armour, her red hair blazing beneath the open sky, she declared that she had the heart and stomach of a king. But behind that moment of immortal glory stood the work of countless hands among them, the hands of Catherine's sons. They had shaped the readiness of the fleet, steadied the politics of Parliament, and whispered courage into the hearts of men who might have faltered. And though no one spoke her name that day, Catherine Carey's legacy stood beside the Queen on that field, not as a ghost, but as the living endurance of her blood. The Spanish Armada fell not to England's cannons alone, but to storm and providence. The sea itself rose to defend the island, scattering Spain's might into wreckage. In the months that followed, the nation rejoiced, and the Queen's star shone brighter than ever. Yet in the quiet corners of victory, the Knollys family continued to serve, their influence steady and indispensable. For Elizabeth's triumph was not merely hers. It belonged to the silent network of kin and loyalty that Catherine had woven across the realm. Her sons had carried her lessons into every chamber of power, that loyalty could outlast scandal, that endurance could outshine ambition, and that faith, when tempered with patience, could preserve even a family marked by rumour. As the years turned toward the late 1580s, time began to weigh upon them all. William, now Earl of Banbury, aged into respectability. His hair silvered, his movements slowed, yet his mind remained sharp as ever. He was the last man to speak to Elizabeth of Catherine Carey, to remind her, gently, of the cousin who had stood by her side through exile, danger, and youth. The Queen listened in silence, her eyes distant, her expression unreadable. Perhaps she remembered those days of laughter and prayer, when Catherine had tended her like a sister. Perhaps she remembered the funeral, the tolling bells, the marble grave, or perhaps she remembered only the fear of loss for Elizabeth, who had outlived all she loved, had learned to mourn without tears. Francis continued his fiery work until his voice grew hoarse and his health declined. The years of debate, of conflict, of carrying the burden of faith had worn him down. Yet even in frailty, he remained unyielding, his conviction undimmed. He often spoke of his mother, though never with sentimentality. He called her a woman of duty, the highest praise he could give. For him, duty was the truest measure of love. When he died, it was said that his last words were a prayer for England and for the Queen who had once honoured his mother's grave. Henry's passing came quietly, as it had to. No banners, no ceremonies, only the soft toll of a parish bell and the fading scent of roses from the garden his mother had once tended in her youth. The three brothers, so different and yet bound by the same invisible thread, had carried Catherine's strength into their final breaths. Through them, her story had not only endured, but multiplied, spreading through their descendants. Through the marriages and titles that tied them to every noble house, from London to Oxfordshire. And through it all, in the echoing halls of Westminster Abbey, the marble that covered Catherine Carey's tomb remained cool and silent. Generations passed by her resting place, some pausing to read the inscription. Most not, but those who did linger claimed they felt something there, a hush that was not merely reverence, but recognition. The air seemed to remember her, as though the abbey itself understood that beneath its stones lay not only a woman who had served a queen, but a mother who had quietly birthed a nation's future. By the time the century neared its end, the Virgin Queen's once radiant court had grown old. The laughter had faded, replaced by the whisper of memories and the shuffle of aging courtiers who clung to her like ghosts. Yet among those ghosts, the presence of Catherine Carey still lingered, woven through the lives of her children and their children after them. The Queen may have been alone in her chambers, but the blood that pulsed through her realm was still hers, or perhaps still Catherine's. It was impossible to tell where one life ended and the other began. And somewhere in that delicate boundary between memory and bloodline, between silence and survival, Catherine Carey lived on unseen, unpraised, but éternel. She had given her sons the strength to serve, and her daughters the courage to defy. She had given England a generation that endured through faith and flame alike. And though her name was spoken softly, it never vanished, for her spirit lingered in the heart of a kingdom that had grown from her womb. The years that followed the defeat of the Spanish Armada should have been golden, but gold tarnishes when touched by too many hands. Elizabeth's court, once a bright constellation of youth and ambition, began to dim with age. The Queen herself aged like marble hard, beautiful and cold to the touch. Her laughter grew rare, her temper quicker, her loneliness, an unspoken spectre, haunting the corridors of Whitehall. The faces that had once surrounded her Dudley, Walsingham, Cecil began to vanish, one by one, leaving empty chairs where history had once breathed. And yet the Knollys family remained, steady as the ticking of a clock, their lives continuing to pulse beneath the surface of England's waning Tudor glory. Catherine Carey had been gone for decades, but her presence lingered, subtle and enduring, like the scent of lavender in the folds of an old gown. Her sons had lived and died as faithful servants of the crown. Her daughters had woven themselves into noble families across the realm, and her grandchildren now stood where she once had, close enough to power to feel its heat, but wise enough to fear its burn. Through them, the hidden Tudor blood still flowed quietly in England's veins, an inheritance carried in the faces of men and women who would never know the full truth of the legacy that bound them to a queen who claimed to be alone in the world. Among Catherine's living legacy stood Lettice Knollys, that unrepentant flame who had defied the Queen and lived long enough to see the world change around her. Time had not softened her, it had only carved her more sharply, as though age itself had refined her defiance into grace. She had outlived her second husband, Robert Dudley, and now, widowed again, she stood at the edge of Elizabeth's reign as a relic and a reminder. The Queen could not forgive her, but she could not forget her either. In the long, sleepless nights of her later years, when the candles burned low and the chamber seemed filled with ghosts, perhaps Elizabeth thought of the woman who had dared to love what she herself had lost and envied her. Lettice had a son by Dudley, a child of scandal named Robert, called the Noble Imp. He was beautiful, bright, and filled with promise, a living echo of the man both women had once adored. But fate was cruel, and the boy died young, snatched away by illness before his life could unfold. His death left Lettice hollow and left Elizabeth facing a strange, bitter mirror of her own barrenness. For though the Queen ruled a nation, her bloodline would end with her. Lettice, the woman she had cursed, had given birth to the only child who might have carried on the legacy of the man Elizabeth had loved most. Yet even that fragile branch had been broken. In that symmetry of grief, the two women were bound once more, the virgin queen who would leave no heir, and the woman who bore love's only proof and lost it. As Elizabeth's court sank into the long twilight of the century, England itself began to shift. The grandeur of the Tudor myth had reached its peak, and beneath its shine the foundations trembled. Religion, that old wound, still bled through every debate and proclamation. Spain had been defeated, but the Catholic threat remained, lurking like a storm beyond the horizon. The Queen's health faltered, her moods darkened, and her courtiers, grown cautious with age, began to whisper about the future. For what would happen when she died? Who would rule a realm built upon her singular will amid this gathering uncertainty? Catherine Carey's descendants prepared themselves as only survivors could. William Knollys, now an aging earl, walked the corridors of power with the quiet confidence of a man who had outlived danger. He had served the Queen faithfully through decades of triumph and turmoil, and though his hair had turned white, his presence still commanded respect. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that loyalty was not a chain, but a bridge, and that when the time came, his family must cross it into whatever age followed the Tudors. His brother Francis had died, but his children and grandchildren continued the line, their blood stretching through parishes, manors, and councils like threads woven into the very fabric of England. Lettice, however, could not stay silent forever. Widowhood gave her freedom, and freedom rekindled her defiance. In her later years, she married again, this time to Sir Christopher Blount, a soldier and courtier half her age. It was a union of companionship and shared ambition, not passion, yet even this last grasp at happiness would end in tragedy. For Blount became entangled in the ill-fated rebellion of the Earl of Essex, Lettice's own son by her first husband, who rose against the Queen in a desperate gamble for power and favour. When the rebellion failed, Essex was captured and executed, his head falling beneath the same cold steel that had once claimed Anne Boleyn. The circle of history had closed upon itself. The Queen had once watched her cousin's mother die upon the scaffold. Now she watched the son of her cousin's daughter meet the same fate. The old Queen was said to have wept when she signed Essex's death warrant, though whether for the boy himself or for the ghosts of all she had lost, no one could say. Lettice, in her exile, received the news in silence. She had known from birth that the favour of a monarch was a blade with two edges. Her mother had taught her that the same hand that could raise a family could also destroy it without hesitation. So she mourned her son not with cries, but with the cold stillness of one who had already buried too many. When her husband Blount followed Essex to the scaffold soon after, her heart must have hardened completely. Yet she did not break. She lived on, a survivor among ruins, the last living daughter of Catherine Carey, the final ember of that indestructible line. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's world shrank. Her health failed. Her voice grew frail, and her mirror became her only companion. The courtiers who had once praised her beauty now watched in uneasy silence as age stripped away the myth. The paint upon her face thickened. The jewels weighed heavier upon her frail body, and yet she clung to them as though they could hold back the darkness. The Queen who had once commanded empires now sat surrounded by ghosts: Robert Dudley, Francis Walsingham, William Cecil, all gone. Only memories remained. And among those memories was Catherine. In her final months, Elizabeth spoke often of the past, her words drifting between lucidity and dream. "I am surrounded by the children of those I loved," she murmured once, "and yet I am alone." Perhaps she meant the Knolleys, whose descendants still served her faithfully. Perhaps she meant Catherine herself, whose spirit she could never escape. When the Queen finally died in the spring of 1603, England did not erupt in chaos, but in a strange and quiet relief. The long reign that had defined an age had ended, and with it the Tudor line. Yet even in death, Elizabeth's legacy was intertwined with Catherine's. For as the crown passed to James of Scotland, uniting the two kingdoms, it was the descendants of Catherine Carey who stood ready to serve the new monarch bridges between two dynasties, living proof that the bloodline of the Tudors had not vanished, merely gone to ground. In the stillness that followed the Queen's passing, London's bells tolled again, as they had for Catherine years before. Those who had known both women felt the strange symmetry of it: two lives bound by fate, two branches of the same hidden tree finally at rest. In the abbey where Catherine slept, the stone floors seemed to remember. Beneath their cold weight, she lay as she had lived, silent, steadfast, eternal. Her womb had given life to the men and women who would guide England into its next chapter. Her blood had mingled with the future, and her legacy, though unspoken, was as indestructible as the kingdom itself. The Queen who had died alone left behind no heir. But she was never without family. The mother who had borne 16 children had given her more than a court or a lineage. She had given her endurance. And that endurance, woven through sons and daughters and centuries, would outlast them both. When James of Scotland crossed the border and claimed the crown of England in that fateful spring of 1603, a new wind swept through London brisk. Tumaid, 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 smelling of the northern heather and the cautious scent of change. The banners of the Tudors were lowered, their crimson lions fading under the grey mist that rolled across the Thames. For the first time in nearly a century, England was ruled not by a child of Henry VIII, but by a stranger who bore none of his blood, or so it seemed. Yet within the veins of many who knelt to welcome the new king, the Tudor line still pulsed in secret, carried by the quiet legacy of Catherine Carey and her 16 children. Though the crown had passed to a Stuart, The heart of the old dynasty had not truly died. It lived on in the unseen threads of family and memory, in the courtiers who whispered of the queen that was gone and the cousin she had loved like a sister. The court that gathered around King James was a different world from the one Elizabeth had ruled, where the Virgin Queen had moved like flame, brilliant, fierce, unpredictable. The new king was cautious and cerebral, his manners less dazzling, his court less restrained. He came surrounded by Scotsmen, who spoke in strange cadences and carried ambitions as broad as their country's hills. Yet among the English nobles, the name of Knollys still carried the weight of loyalty and endurance. They had served one monarch faithfully and would now serve another. For survival was a tradition written into their blood. William Knollys, the aging Earl of Banbury, bent his knee to James with the calm of a man who had outlived both scandal and glory. His bow was not submission but inheritance, the quiet continuation of service that had begun in the shadow of Catherine Carey's cradle. For the new king, the Knollys family was a bridge between the Tudors and the Stuarts, between the golden age that had ended and the uncertain dawn now rising. In their faces, perhaps, James saw something that unsettled him, the echo of a line he had replaced but could not erase. For though his claim was strong by law, there were those who still whispered that the blood of the true Tudors ran through another branch, one born of a woman whose name was buried beneath Westminster stone. Rumours, faint but persistent, began to drift once more through the corridors of Whitehall, stories of Catherine Carey, the possible daughter of Henry VIII, and how her descendants still moved among the highest ranks of England's nobility. The new king dismissed such talk as the foolishness of courtiers nostalgic for a vanished queen, but history has a way of breathing through walls. And secrets, once spoken, never truly die. In those first years of James's reign, the city seemed to hold two spirits at once, the living present of the Stuarts and the lingering ghost of Elizabeth's age. Portraits of the dead queen still hung in the great houses, her pale face framed in ruffs that caught the candlelight like frost. Poets still sang of her triumphs, sailors still toasted her name, and beneath all the mourning and memory, the families who had thrived under her rule adjusted to the new order with the quiet skill of those long accustomed to danger. The Knollys heirs were among them, steady, deliberate, and watchful. They offered the new monarch loyalty, but not love. For love belonged to another age. What they gave instead was what their mother had given all her life: endurance. Lettice Knollys still lived then, though she was older than the queen who had banished her had ever become. Nearly 80 years had passed since her birth, and she wore her age like armour. The once fiery beauty of her youth had softened into the regal calm of a matriarch whose gaze could still command a room. She had outlived husbands, sons, and queens, and yet she remained the last living daughter of Catherine Carey, the final witness to the world that had birthed her. When she heard that Elizabeth was dead, they said she did not weep. Instead, she stood in her garden at Drayton Basset and looked toward London, whispering, "So ends the crown that feared me." It was not bitterness, but something quieter, the voice of a survivor who understood that victory and loss were often the same thing. Separated only by time, Lettice had seen her mother buried in Westminster, had seen her son executed for rebellion, had seen her queen turn to dust. Now, as the new king reigned, she became a relic of an older world, her name mentioned with a mixture of fascination and fear. Some called her the widow of the two great lords, others the queen's shadow. Yet behind the gossip was a deeper truth. She was the living embodiment of Catherine Carey's endurance, proof that even a woman cast out by a queen could not be erased from history. She spent her final years in reflection, surrounded by grandchildren and great-grandchildren who would one day forget the full measure of her sorrow. When she died, past the age of 90, she was laid to rest beside the man who had loved her against a queen's command. Her tomb bore no crown, no emblem of rebellion, only her name, carved with the quiet dignity that her mother would have approved. The Knollys line, strengthened by marriages and titles, spread across England like roots beneath the soil, unseen but nourishing the realm from below. Their estates prospered, their blood mingled with that of other noble houses, and through them the memory of Catherine Carey passed from story into legend. Children whispered that she had been a princess in secret. Servants crossed themselves when they passed her tomb, as though she might rise again if her name were spoken aloud. The truth of her birth, like so much of Tudor history, lay somewhere between sin and sanctity. But what mattered most was not whose child she had been, but what kind of legacy she had left. In a world ruled by men, she had carved a dynasty through endurance alone, and the generations that followed her carried that strength as a birthright. In the reign of King James, the great changes of the age began to stir the spread of new ideas. The tension of faith and reason, the restless hum of empire beyond the sea. Yet through all of it, the descendants of Catherine Carey remained constant, shaping England in quiet ways that history rarely records. They governed counties, commanded regiments, sat in parliament, and counselled kings. Their names appeared in the margins of great events, small signatures beneath the thunder of centuries. And though the world around them changed, they still carried the memory of a woman whose life had begun in scandal and ended in grace. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, the king himself would walk through the abbey, his footsteps echoing against the ancient stones. The air there was thick with history, with prayers, with ghosts. When he passed the resting place of Catherine Carey, he might have paused, though there is no record of it. Perhaps he did not know who lay beneath that slab of marble. Perhaps he did. Perhaps some courtier had whispered to him that she had been the cousin of Elizabeth, the daughter of Mary Boleyn, or that her father had once been a king. Perhaps, in that moment, the new monarch of England felt the strange, invisible touch of the past upon his crown. For the abbey had buried queens and saints and sinners alike, but none more quietly powerful than the woman whose body had birthed 16 lives and whose blood now ran, unknowingly, through the veins of those who ruled the realm she had once served. And so, in the twilight between two dynasties, the story of Catherine Carey became the story of England itself, a tale of survival written in flesh and silence. The Tudors had ended, but their echo lingered, and it was her echo most of all. The queen who died childless had been carried through time by the cousin who had borne too many children to count. Between them, they had built the paradox of an empire that glorified a virgin and endured through a mother. And though their tombs lay apart, one beneath the glittering vaults of Westminster, the other beneath the stones of Richmond, their souls were bound together by the same pulse of destiny, the same haunting truth that power does not always rest with those who wear the crown, but with those who quietly outlive it. Time is a thief that works in silence. It moves not in great storms, but in the small, patient gestures of forgetting. As the Stuart kings settled into their rule, the court of England changed its language, its fashion, its soul. The laughter of Elizabeth's reign was replaced by solemnity, the music softer, the politics more intricate. The portraits of the Virgin Queen faded beneath layers of dust, her pale face hidden behind new paintings of kings with dark beards and heavier crowns. The great tapestry of the Tudors began to unravel, and yet, woven deep within its frayed threads, the faint pattern of Catherine Carey's story still remained invisible to most, but never erased. The sons and daughters she had brought into the world multiplied into branches that reached across counties, parishes, and generations. The Knollys estates thrived, their lands broad and well kept, their halls echoing with the footsteps of children who no longer remembered the mother who had birthed their dynasty. They spoke proudly of loyalty and lineage. But few knew the full tale of the woman whose endurance had given them their place in history. In an age obsessed with kings, women's stories were the first to vanish. The marble that covered Catherine's tomb in Westminster had grown pale and unvisited, her inscription fading. Where hands once traced her name, the abbey itself had changed too. What had been a sanctuary of Tudor glory now hummed with the prayers of new monarchs and new ambitions. Yet her blood remained restless. It moved through time like a secret current beneath calm waters. Her grandsons and great-grandsons became courtiers, ambassadors, soldiers, men who carried England's banners across oceans and into wars she could never have imagined. Her granddaughters married into families that would one day stand beside kings, their names absorbed into new titles, their children raised among the ruling class of a nation beginning to stretch beyond its island. They did not know they were carrying a queen's shadow inside their veins, that the endurance of a woman buried a century before still shaped the rhythm of their lives. The early years of King James's rule brought peace. But peace is a fragile thing in England. The old tensions of faith still simmered beneath the surface. In 1605, the gunpowder plot threatened to blow apart the very heart of London, and in that moment of terror, among the families who watched the city tremble, there were those who bore Catherine's blood. They stood with the Protestant court, loyal as their fathers had been, their allegiance unquestioned. When the conspirators were caught and hanged, England's relief was immense, but so was its fear. The line between faith and treason had never been so thin. The Knollys' name, once whispered with suspicion under Catholic queens, was now spoken with respect under Protestant kings. Catherine's endurance had not been wasted. Her children's loyalty had become a shield for generations. Yet history, like the sea, does not care whom it carries forward or whom it drowns. The Stuart court that followed was less kind, its tides unpredictable. King Charles I, with his divine sense of right and his stubborn pride, led England into a storm that Catherine could not have foreseen. Civil war tore the nation apart, pitting crown against conscience, loyalty against survival. In that great fracture, her descendants found themselves divided. Some fought for the king, bound by generations of royal service. Others sided with Parliament, guided by the fierce Protestant faith that had once driven Francis Knollys into exile. It was as though Catherine's own divided spirit, her obedience and her defiance, had split into living factions, replaying her life across a nation at war with itself. When the king's head fell on a cold January morning in 1649, the world Catherine had known was gone. No more courts glittering with music. No more queens who ruled by charm or terror. England had become a republic, its throne empty, its church trembling, its nobles scattered. Yet even in that darkness, her bloodline endured. The Knollys estates were damaged but not destroyed, their name reduced but not erased. Her descendants adapted as she had always done, bowing when they must, waiting when they could, surviving every tide until the monarchy rose again. And when it did, under Charles II, they returned quietly to the world of power, older and wiser, ghosts among the living. By the late 17th century, the age of reason had dawned, and England's eyes turned toward the future science, trade, empire, and the slow unfolding of modern life. The stories of queens and mistresses, of secret births and whispered bloodlines, began to sound like relics from another world. Scholars wrote of Henry VIII as a symbol of tyranny, of Elizabeth as the virgin sovereign, but Catherine's name appeared only in footnotes. Her life reduced to a line on a genealogical chart: Mary Boleyn's daughter, wife to Francis Knollys, mother of 16. The great chroniclers of empire had no room for her tears, her fevers, her sleepless nights of childbirth. Yet if history forgot her name, it could not forget her consequence. For through her womb had come a network of families who would fill the parliament benches, command ships at sea, and marry into the ranks of the English aristocracy that ruled the world. In the quiet corners of manor libraries, old portraits still watched from the walls' faces with the unmistakable curve of the Boleyn cheekbone, the same sharp eyes that had once stared down kings. They were Catherine's descendants, though few of them knew it. The fire that had burned in her mother, Mary Boleyn, and her aunt, Queen Anne, flickered still in those faces, a small, stubborn light refusing to go out. They carried the mark of survival, the inheritance of women who had learned to live beneath crowns without ever wearing them. In that sense, Catherine Carey had achieved what no Tudor monarch ever had. She had created a legacy that could not be undone. Sometimes, when storms rolled across London, the abbey bells would toll in the distance, and travellers taking shelter beneath its arches swore they heard faint voices within the stone, not prayers, but echoes. The monks would say it was the wind. The tourists would laugh. But those who lingered long enough sometimes felt a different kind of silence there, deep and humming, like the heartbeat of something waiting to be remembered. Beneath one of those slabs lay the woman who had lived a lifetime in service, whose children had carried England into its next age. No one brought flowers to her grave anymore, but the air above it still seemed to hum with the warmth of her story. If any of her descendants ever stopped to read her name in the abbey, they might have felt it, that strange pull between pride and sorrow, between the glory of ancestry and the humility of mortality. For Catherine's life had been a paradox of greatness hidden beneath obedience, of strength disguised as gentleness. She had never raised a crown, yet she had raised a dynasty. She had never ruled, yet she had ensured the kingdom's continuity through her body, her faith, her silence, and even though the centuries forgot to speak her name, her blood refused to forget itself. It built England's houses, shaped its parliament, carried its banners, and whispered its prayers. By the end of that century, the marble of her tomb had cracked slightly with age, candle soot blackened its edges, and moss crept along the carved letters, yet the stone held firm, as she had. Beneath it lay not only the remains of a woman, but the pulse of a lineage that had survived plague, fire, war, and betrayal. The Tudors were gone, the Stuarts were fading, but the hidden daughter of a king still lingered, her legacy alive in every child who walked beneath England's sky. Time had stolen her name from history's pages, but it could not steal her echo, the quiet, enduring song of a woman who had outlived her queens, heir lovers, and her kings. The 18th century came softly, like a mist creeping over fields once stained by war. England awoke to the sound of commerce and conquest, the chiming of coins, the rhythm of sails on distant seas. It was no longer the land of queens and courtiers that Catherine Carey had known. The world she had served had turned its face toward the horizon, and her descendants, though scattered and changed, were among those who carried it there. They did not wear crowns, yet they bore the weight of legacy. They did not speak her name, yet they lived her inheritance each time they bowed before duty, each time they endured. The Knollys family, by now a vast network of lords, ladies, and soldiers, had blended into the body of the nation so completely that their story was no longer separate from England's own. Some served in Parliament, drafting laws that would shape the empire. Others became governors in faraway colonies, carrying the English flag across oceans that stretched farther than the dreams of any Tudor court. Their daughters married into houses whose names gleamed in the new age of enlightenment, names that would one day fill the ledgers of industry and the halls of government. They had become part of the establishment that Catherine's endurance had quietly made possible. The hidden daughter of a king had birthed a dynasty of empire builders, though no chronicler would ever write it that way. The London of this new world was no longer the city she had known, its narrow streets now alive with the rattle of carriages, its air thick with the scent of smoke and salt from the docks. The abbey still stood, solemn and patient, its stones unchanged even as centuries turned. But the pilgrims who came there now sought the graves of poets and scientists, of Newton and Dryden, of philosophers who measured the world instead of praying for it. The queens of old had become marble faces in the half-light, their histories, curiosities for those who lingered too long. Somewhere among them, still, lay Catherine Carey, her resting place, forgotten by the living but not by time. Her name, carved faintly into the stone, survived in the same stubborn way she had quietly, with no need for applause. Heplul, meanwhile, had travelled farther than any of her ancestors could have imagined. A great-grandson fought under the Union Jack at sea. His ship caught in the fog off the coast of France. Another sailed to the Americas, where his children would grow up under a different sky, their voices echoing the accents of a country not yet born. The women of her line were no less enduring. Some became patrons of artists and writers, keeping alive the grace and intellect that had marked Catherine's presence at Elizabeth's court. Others lived humbler lives, raising children in the countryside, unaware that the pulse in their veins carried the echo of two dynasties, one crowned in gold, the other buried in silence. History moved forward as it always does, pretending to forget what it has simply hidden. The age of reason gave way to the age of empire, and England became the heart of a world too vast to imagine. The ships that carried tea, silk, and gunpowder across the oceans were manned by men who had never heard of the Tudors. Yet their wages were signed by descendants of Catherine Carey's blood. The sons of her sons governed provinces, ruled colonies, and fought wars in the name of kings who would never know their names. And still, her presence lingered not in books, not in songs, but in the living endurance of her lineage. In the countryside, at the edge of Oxfordshire, one of her descendants built a grand estate, its gardens stretching toward the horizon. The portraits in its long gallery told a history that began with Parliament and soldiers, but if one looked closely, there were traces of something older: the curve of a cheek, the tilt of a chin, eyes that glimmered with quiet defiance. The family's records spoke of honour and duty, but they never mentioned the scandal from which they had sprung. It was as if the centuries had decided to forgive what they could not erase. Perhaps that was Catherine's final victory, that she had transformed shame into strength so thoroughly that even memory itself forgot where the wound had begun. In London, the poets of the 18th century wrote of time as a river, carrying all things toward the sea. If they had stood before Catherine's grave, they might have understood the truth of their own words, for her story had flowed quietly through generations, merging into the greater tide of England's fate. Her endurance had become the rhythm of her nation, unseen but essential. The women of her line bore children while their husbands went to war, their prayers echoing hers. The men served, Argydd, conquered, and built. Through them, the mother of 16 lived again, her spirit woven into the vast machinery of empire. And yet, for all the grandeur that her bloodline achieved, her name remained buried in silence. The priests who swept the abbey floors could no longer recall who she had been. Tourists stepped over her stone, their footsteps wearing down the letters that had once been carved so carefully. But stones remember what tongues forget. At night, when the candles flickered low and the wind whispered through the old arches, it was said that the abbey breathed not with the solemnity of kings, but with the quiet hum of all who had ever endured there. Among them was Catherine, the woman who had carried the weight of 16 lives and a secret that had changed a kingdom. Her story, if it could have spoken, might have said that legacy is not measured in fame or monuments, but in the way the world continues to move after you are gone. She had no crown, yet her descendants wore titles across 3 centuries. She had no voice, yet her blood spoke in Parliament and across the seas. She had no history written for her, yet she became the invisible foundation of one. Her endurance had outlasted every dynasty she had served: the Tudors, the Stuarts, and now the rising Hanoverian kings who ruled in the name of progress. By the middle of the 18th century, the great houses of England stood like islands of memory in a sea of change. Inside them, candlelight glowed against walls lined with ancestors. And somewhere in those portraits, perhaps in the eyes of a young heiress or the profile of a naval officer, Catherine Carey looked back, not as a ghost, but as a quiet truth that refused to die. Her face had become the face of England itself, proud, enduring, endlessly remade by history. The empire grew, and time marched forward, but the woman who had once stood beside a queen, who had carried the weight of a nation in her womb, still lay beneath the stones of Westminster, her story murmuring beneath the hum of the centuries. The marble above her might crumble, the letters might fade, but what she left behind could not be undone. For Catherine Carey had built her monument in flesh and blood, in courage and silence, in the 16 children who had carried her into eternity. And so, as the world changed its kings, its creeds, and its borders, one truth remained unbroken: that history is not only written by those who rule, but by those who endure. She had been the daughter of scandal, the servant of a queen, the mother of a dynasty. She had lived in the margins of glory and died in the heart of it. And though her name was nearly lost, her story had become the quiet breath beneath England's rise, the pulse behind its power, the hidden thread that time could never cut. Century passed, and England transformed again. The world outside the abbey walls roared with the thunder of machines, the whistle of steam, the voices of a people who had built an empire from trade and toil. The names of kings changed. The shape of the realm expanded beyond imagination, and history became a vast theatre where new actors took the stage. Yet deep beneath the echoing arches of Westminster, the tomb of Catherine Carey remained where it had always been: silent, patient, unchanging. Time had rubbed away the gold from its letters, the marble dulled by centuries of footsteps. But the story it guarded could not be erased. The woman buried there was no longer merely a servant to a queen. She had become something greater, something more enduring, the quiet heart of a dynasty that refused to die. By the 19th century, scholars began to wander the abbey with notebooks in hand, cataloguing the graves of the long dead. They came searching for poets and warriors, for monarchs and saints, and among their lists they found her name. Few of them recognized it: Catherine Knollys. One wrote, "Chief Lady of the Bedchamber to Queen Elizabeth." A simple note, nothing more. But those who lingered long enough to trace the letters with their fingertips often paused, as though the stone itself hummed with memory. For those who knew their history, the name carried a ghostly weight. It was the name of a woman who had lived at the center of power and yet remained on its edge, who had given her youth and her body to the making of a dynasty, and who had been forgotten by the very history she helped to shape. Outside the abbey, The city had become a living beast. London's skies were blackened by smoke, its streets choked with people and carriages, its river glimmering with the reflection of gaslight. The empire was at its height, the sun never setting on the land that Catherine's descendants had helped to build. Across the world, from the Caribbean to India, her bloodline worked unseen governors, ministers, officers, and scholars, their faces pale in the heat of foreign suns. They spoke of duty and progress, of trade and law, but unknowingly they were carrying forward the same spirit that had driven their ancestor to endure when the world had turned against her. Catherine Carey had not vanished. She had multiplied. Her body had turned to dust, but her will had become a kind of living current that flowed through every generation. In quiet libraries and candlelit drawing rooms, antiquarians began to unearth the old rumours, the ones whispered during the reign of Henry VIII and revived under Elizabeth. Some called them legends. Others believed them half-truths shaped by envy. But as scholars traced the tangled lines of Tudor blood, one question rose again, like a ghost from the past. Who was Catherine Carey's father? Was she truly the daughter of William Carey, the loyal courtier who claimed her? Or was she the secret child of the king himself, the flesh and blood of Henry VIII, hidden beneath a name that could not be spoken aloud? The question could never be proven, yet it refused to die. For in the faces of her descendants, the resemblance lingered: the same sharp eyes, the same defiant jaw, the same restless spark that marked those born of the Tudor line. Historian debated, priest denied, and poets imagined, but perhaps the truth was never meant to be written in ink. It was written instead in the strange symmetry of fate. Catherine had served the daughter of the very man who may have fathered her. She had been the mother of 16, while that daughter Elizabeth had borne none. One had built a legacy of flesh, the other a legacy of legend. And between them stretched the great paradox of womanhood, in a world ruled by men, one remembered by glory, the other by endurance. In time, visitors to the abbey began to rediscover her name. Tour guides, tracing the path of England's queens, began to point to her tomb as they passed. Here lies Lady Catherine Knollys, they would say, cousin to Queen Elizabeth, rumoured to be her sister. Some listeners smiled at the scandal of it. Others felt the chill of history in their bones. For what was rumour if not a kind of survival? Every whisper that carried her name kept her from disappearing entirely. And when the great bells tolled for the anniversaries of monarchs long dead, it was said that the echo lingered a little longer near her stone, as though time itself bowed in recognition. Meanwhile, the modern world forgot her once more. The abbey grew crowded with new monuments, marble effigies rising around her like a forest of ghosts. Her resting place became one among thousands, a faint outline beneath centuries of footsteps. Yet still, her story refused to vanish completely. Genealogists tracing the roots of England's noble families found her everywhere, her name branching like a river through generations of peers and politicians, through marriages that joined her line to nearly every great house of the realm. It was as if her spirit had scattered itself across history, ensuring that though her tomb was forgotten, her blood was not. In the quiet hours of night, when the abbey slept and the city's hum softened into stillness, those who guarded its halls sometimes spoke of strange sounds. They said they heard soft footsteps where no visitor walked, the faint rustle of silk, a woman's sigh that came from nowhere. One old verger swore that he had seen the outline of a lady standing near the tomb, her face pale, her eyes sad but unafraid. Perhaps it was imagination, or perhaps it was history reminding the living that not all who are buried are gone. For Catherine Carey, daughter of rumour and mother of empire, had become a legend too subtle for books and too human for myth. She was the quiet breath between centuries, the voice that whispered through stone that every life, no matter how hidden, can alter the course of the world. If one listens carefully in that sacred silence, one might almost hear her still, the murmur of a prayer, half remembered, the rustle of a gown against the cold marble floor, the lullaby of a woman who had once sung to 16 sleeping children, while a queen above her dreamed of power. History has no mercy for women like her. It writes their names in the margins and then forgets them. But the margins endure, even when the page fades. Her story is not the tragedy of a forgotten woman, but the triumph of an immortal one, for she built her eternity not from glory, but from survival, and so she remains the unseen matriarch of England's story. Her body at rest, but her legacy awake. The abbey keeps her secret. The city moves above her, and the centuries continue to breathe her name in ways they do not even notice. Catherine Carey, the child of scandal, the servant of a queen, the mother of 16 lives, still in the blood of 1,000 houses, in the endurance of every soul that chooses faith over fear, duty over despair. Her tomb may whisper to no one now, but its silence is full. It holds the weight of all she gave and all she became. The stone that marks her grave is small compared to those around it. Yet in its stillness lies a greater kingdom than any carved from power. It is the kingdom of remembrance, the quiet, eternal rule of a woman who carried the past within her body and gave the future to the world. The daughter of rumour, the mother of England, the ghost who never died. Her story does not end beneath the marble. It continues wherever her blood still beats, wherever endurance still speaks louder than pride, wherever a woman walks silently through history and leaves behind something that no one can ever take away.